The small town of Pine Ridge sat quietly under the early morning sun as FBI Special Agent Renee Carter pulled her government-issued sedan into the parking lot of the local police station. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before stepping out. This wasn't her first difficult assignment, but something in her gut told her this one would test her in ways she hadn't experienced before. Pine Ridge looked peaceful on the surface. Tidy storefronts lining Main Street, American flags fluttering from lampposts, children riding bikes on sidewalks. But beneath this picture-perfect exterior, something ugly had been brewing. Over the past 6 months, businesses owned by immigrant families had been targeted in a series of escalating attacks. First came the broken windows and spray-painted slurs, then threatening letters, and finally, last week, a fire that had nearly killed the Thai family who lived above their restaurant. The FBI had been called in after local police showed little progress in solving the crimes. Renee had reviewed the case files on her drive from the regional office and found them suspiciously thin. Critical evidence appeared to be missing, witness statements were incomplete, and follow-up investigations seemed half-hearted at best. As she walked toward the brick building that housed both the police department and City Hall, Renee adjusted her navy blue blazer and made sure her badge was visible on her belt. First impressions mattered, especially here. The reception area was small but neat, with a middle-aged woman behind a high counter who looked up when the door chimed. "Can I help you?" she asked, her smile polite but eyes cautious. "Special Agent Renee Carter, FBI," Renee said, showing her credentials. "I have a meeting with Chief Wilson." The receptionist picked up her phone and spoke quietly. "Chief's in a meeting, but Captain Walters can see you. He's handling the cases you're here about." Renee nodded, though this wasn't what had been arranged. She'd specifically requested a meeting with the department head. Already the pattern of obstruction she'd suspected was beginning to show itself. Captain James Walters appeared a few minutes later. He was tall, with a military-style crew cut and a physique that suggested he'd once been very fit, but had softened with age and desk duty. His handshake was firm, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Agent Carter, welcome to Pine Ridge, though I'm not sure why the federal government thinks we need help with some vandalism cases. 4 businesses completely destroyed and 1 family nearly killed is a bit more than vandalism." "Captain," Renee replied, keeping her tone professionally neutral, "especially when the pattern suggests these are hate crimes." Walters scoffed. "That's a stretch. We've got teenage troublemakers, not terrorists. I'd like to see the evidence you've collected so far and speak with the investigating officers," Renee said, ignoring his dismissive attitude. "Of course. We're an open book," Walters said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Let me introduce you to Sergeant Briggs. He's been the lead on these cases." As they walked through the bullpen, Renee noticed how conversation died down as they passed. Officers glanced up from their desks with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. She'd expected some resistance. Local departments often resented federal involvement, but something here felt different, more personal. Sergeant Trevor Briggs was reviewing paperwork at his desk when they approached. He was younger than Walters, maybe mid-40s, with a ruddy complexion and close-set eyes that narrowed when Walters introduced Renee. "FBI, huh? Guess nobody has real crimes to solve anymore," Briggs said, leaning back in his chair. "I'd like to see your case files on the attacks on the Lynn Grocery, Patel Convenience Store, Garcia Auto Shop, and the Swat Restaurant," Renee said, ignoring the bait. "Sure thing, though there's not much to see. These folks, they come here and don't understand how things work. They don't secure their properties, they don't have proper insurance, and then they cry foul when something happens." Briggs pulled open a drawer and took out a surprisingly thin folder. "Here's what we've got." Renee took the folder, immediately noting that it contained far less than what should have been gathered in investigations spanning 6 months. "This is everything?" "We're a small department, Agent Carter. We don't have fancy labs and unlimited overtime budgets like you folks." Renee flipped through the pages, her concern growing. "There are no photos of the crime scenes, no evidence logs, no interview transcripts from the witnesses mentioned in these reports." Walters shrugged. "Budget cuts. We had to let our photographer go last year. Officers take notes on conversations rather than formal statements for minor cases. The arson at the Swat Restaurant sent 3 people to the hospital." "That's not minor," Renee pointed out, "and I don't see any mention of security camera footage. The report notes there were cameras at both the convenience store and the auto shop." "Technical difficulties," Briggs said with a smirk. Equipment malfunction. Renee closed the folder. I'll need to speak with the victims directly and visit the crime scenes. Knock yourself out, Briggs said. But these people, they exaggerate. Looking for insurance money or special treatment. I'd also like to meet with Chief Wilson, Renee added, directing this to Walters. Chief's a busy man. Budget meetings all week with the town council, Walters said. He's authorized me to provide whatever assistance you need. Renee nodded, though she didn't believe him for a second. I'll also need a workspace while I'm in town. There's a coffee shop down the street with free Wi-Fi, Briggs suggested with a chuckle. Sergeant, Walters said in a warning tone, though he looked amused. We can set you up in the conference room when it's not in use. Most days after 2 p.m., it's free. Thank you, Renee said, maintaining her professional demeanor despite their obvious attempts to make her unwelcome. I'll start with the conference room today if that's possible. I need to review what you have and make some calls. An hour later, Renee sat alone in the small conference room, spreading out the meager files on the table. What she found was worse than she'd expected. Critical witness statements were missing pages. Evidence that had been logged in initial reports was never processed. Follow-up interviews with potential suspects were cursory at best. She pulled out her phone and called her supervisor, keeping her voice low. It's worse than we thought, sir. They're actively obstructing. Either the department is completely incompetent, or they're deliberately tanking these investigations. Both could be true, her supervisor replied. What's your read on the situation? The leadership here, at least the captain and one sergeant I've met, they don't even try to hide their prejudice. They referred to the victims as these people and suggested they were making false reports for insurance money. Classic deflection, her supervisor said. What about the chief? Conveniently unavailable. I think they're circling the wagons. You need backup? Renee considered this. Not yet. I want to talk to the victims first, see what they've been told. If I show up with a team, these guys will shut down completely. Your call, but be careful. Small-town politics can get ugly fast. After ending the call, Renee decided her next step was to visit the crime scenes herself. As she gathered her things, she noticed a young officer hovering near the door. He was baby-faced, probably a recent academy graduate, and looked nervous. Can I help you? She asked. The young officer glanced over his shoulder before stepping into the room and closing the door. Officer Ryan Chen, he said quietly. I heard you were looking into the attacks on the immigrant businesses. That's right, Renee said, instantly alert to his cautious manner. There's something you should know, Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. The night of the fire at the Thai restaurant, I was first on scene. I found something, a lighter with an engraving. I logged it as evidence, but later Sergeant Briggs told me it had been processed and wasn't relevant. He paused. But when I checked later, there was no record it had ever been sent to the lab. Do you know where it is now? Renee asked. Chen shook his head. No, but that's not all. The owner, Mr. Sawat, he told me he'd received threatening calls. When I mentioned this to Briggs, he said not to include it in my report. Said it would complicate things unnecessarily. Why are you telling me this? Renee asked, though she already suspected the answer. Because I became a cop to help people, Chen said simply.
All people?
What's happening here? It's wrong. Their conversation was interrupted by the door swinging open. Captain Walters stood there, his expression dark as he looked between them. Officer Chen, aren't you supposed to be on patrol? Yes, sir. Just asking Agent Carter if she needed directions around town, Chen said, his face carefully blank. I'm sure the FBI agent can use GPS like everyone else, Walters said coldly. Get back to work. As Chen left, Walters turned to Renee. Word of advice, Agent, be careful who you talk to around here. Some of our newer officers don't understand how things work yet. And how do things work, Captain? Renee asked, meeting his gaze steadily. We look after our own in Pine Ridge, Walters said. Always have. These outsiders moving in, changing the town, causing problems, they're not our priority. He smiled thinly. Neither are feds who stir up trouble where there isn't any. Renee gathered her files, maintaining her composure. I'll keep that in mind. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have crime scenes to visit. As she walked to her car, Renee felt a mix of anger and determination. The casual racism, the deliberate obstruction, the implied threats. It was all worse than she'd anticipated. But now she had confirmation of what she'd suspected. Evidence was being hidden or destroyed, and at least one officer was uncomfortable enough with the situation to risk his job by talking to her. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Be careful. Eyes everywhere. Some of us want the truth. She didn't need to ask who it was from. As Renee drove toward the burned-out shell of what had once been the Sawat family restaurant, she knew this case had just become about much more than solving a series of hate crimes. It was about exposing a rot that had apparently infected an entire police department. A rot that threatened the very concept of justice in this seemingly peaceful town. 3 days after her arrival in Pine Ridge, Renee Carter sat in her motel room surrounded by notes, photos, and interview transcripts. The desk lamp cast long shadows across the walls as she pieced together what was becoming a disturbing picture of systematic negligence and prejudice. Her visits to the victims had been eye-opening. Each family told similar stories: slow police response times, dismissive attitudes from investigating officers, important details left out of official reports, and a growing sense that they were unwelcome in the town they'd chosen to call home. The Sawat family, still staying with relatives while recovering from smoke inhalation, had shown Renee a box of threatening letters they'd received in the weeks before the fire. Letters they'd handed over to Sergeant Briggs, who had dismissed them as probably just kids and apparently never logged them as evidence. The Lynn family, whose grocery store had been vandalized 3 times, had security camera footage of the most recent attack. They'd given the police a copy, but when Renee asked about it at the station, Briggs claimed the file had been corrupted. Fortunately, the Lynns had kept the original. Renee's phone buzzed. It was a text from Officer Chen. Meeting tomorrow, 8 a.m., Chief will be there. Finally, she thought. After days of excuses and delays, she would get to speak with the head of the department. She wasn't optimistic that Chief Wilson would be any more helpful than his subordinates, but protocol demanded she try working through the chain of command before escalating matters. Morning came too quickly after a night of restless sleep. Renee dressed carefully in her most professional suit and arrived at the station 10 minutes early, determined to set the tone of the meeting. The conference room was already occupied when she arrived. Chief Wilson sat at the head of the table, a stocky man with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years on patrol before moving up the ranks. Captain Walters sat to his right and Sergeant Briggs to his left. 3 other officers Renee hadn't met were also present, creating a wall of blue uniforms on one side of the table. Agent Carter, Chief Wilson said, rising to shake her hand. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable. I understand you've been busy. Yes, sir, Renee replied, taking the sole empty seat across from them. I appreciate you making time to meet. Let's cut to the chase, Wilson said, leaning forward. You've been in our town for 3 days, questioning my officer's work, making accusations of evidence mishandling, and stirring up the foreign business owners. I'd like to know why the FBI feels the need to interfere in local police matters. Renee met his gaze steadily. With respect, Chief Wilson, I'm investigating what appears to be a pattern of hate crimes that have been inadequately addressed by local law enforcement. That falls under federal jurisdiction. Hate crimes, Wilson repeated with a dismissive wave. That's quite a leap from some vandalism and an accidental fire. Sir, the fire at the Sawat restaurant was ruled arson by your own fire department, Renee pointed out. And when businesses owned by immigrant families are repeatedly targeted while others are left alone, that suggests bias motivation. This town has had break-ins and vandalism for years, Briggs cut in. These folks just moved here. They don't know our history. They think they're being targeted because they're different. But that's just their perception. Renee opened her folder and laid out crime scene photos she'd taken herself. Alongside the few official police photos that existed, the word leave was spray-painted at 3 of the 4 crime scenes. Racial slurs were used in 2. That's not perception, that's evidence. Evidence of teenage stupidity, maybe, Walters said with a chuckle that several of the other officers echoed. I've also found significant gaps in your investigation, Renee continued, ignoring the interruption. Missing evidence, incomplete interviews, leads that weren't followed up on. We're understaffed and overworked, Wilson said, his tone hardening. Not every small-town department has the resources of the federal government. I understand resource constraints, Renee acknowledged. But some of these issues go beyond that. Security footage that was collected but never logged. Threatening letters handed over to officers that never made it into evidence. Witness statements with missing pages. A tense silence fell over the room. Chief Wilson's expression darkened. That sounds like you're accusing my department of misconduct, Agent Carter. I'm stating facts based on my investigation so far, Renee replied calmly. Facts that raise serious concerns about how these cases have been handled. Wilson exchanged glances with Walters before turning back to Renee. Let me be clear. We've been policing this town effectively for decades. Crime is low, people feel safe. Then these foreigners move in, don't adapt to our ways, and suddenly we're under federal scrutiny. The victims are American citizens and legal residents, Renee corrected. And they have the right to equal protection under the law, regardless of their national origin. We know the law, Agent, Walters said coldly. Then you know I have the authority to take over these investigations completely, Renee replied. But I'd prefer to work cooperatively with your department. All I'm asking for is full access to all evidence, complete case files, and the cooperation of your officers in following up on leads that were previously ignored. Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. And if I refuse? Then I'll have no choice but to report to my superiors that the Pine Ridge Police Department is actively obstructing a federal investigation, which could trigger a much larger Justice Department response. The threat hung in the air. Renee could see the calculations happening behind Wilson's eyes. He was weighing his options, trying to determine how serious she was and how far she would go. Finally, he nodded. Fine. You'll get access to everything we have. Sergeant Briggs will be your liaison. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. But I warn you, Agent Carter, you won't find what you're looking for because it isn't there. This is a good town with good people. Don't go making trouble where there isn't any. As the officers filed out, Renee noticed Officer Chen among them, keeping his eyes carefully averted from hers. Only Briggs remained, his expression a mixture of annoyance and something that looked almost like amusement. Looks like we'll be working together, he said once they were alone. I'll get you those files you wanted. All of them, Sergeant. And I want to interview every officer who responded to these incidents. Whatever you say, Agent, Briggs replied with a shrug. But don't be surprised when you hit dead ends. Some cases just don't get solved. These will, Renee said firmly. 2 hours later, Renee sat in the conference room again, now surrounded by evidence boxes that Briggs had reluctantly provided. To her surprise, there was significantly more material than she'd been shown initially. The question was whether this represented the full extent of the evidence, or if there was still more being withheld. As she sorted through photos, reports, and bagged evidence, she heard a soft knock at the door. Officer Chen entered, carrying a stack of files. Sergeant Briggs asked me to bring you these additional reports, he said loudly, for the benefit of anyone listening, then more quietly as he placed the files down. Check the third file, page with a coffee stain. Renee nodded almost imperceptibly, and Chen left without another word. She waited a few minutes before casually opening the third file and flipping through until she found a page with a brown stain in one corner. Beneath it was a handwritten note. Security footage from bank across from Lynn Grocery. Never logged in evidence. Copy on flash drive under stapler in left desk drawer. Keeping her expression neutral, Renee continued reviewing the files, making notes as if nothing unusual had happened. An hour later, she announced to the officer stationed outside the conference room that she needed to use the restroom. On her way back, she passed through the now empty bullpen. Most officers were out on patrol or at lunch. Glancing around to ensure she was unobserved, she quickly located Chen's desk and checked under the stapler. Sure enough, a small flash drive was taped there. Back in the conference room, Renee plugged the drive into her laptop. The footage showed a clear view of the street outside the Lynn Grocery on the night of the most recent vandalism. At 2:17 a.m., a pickup truck pulled up and 3 men got out. They worked quickly, breaking windows and spray painting the storefront. The resolution wasn't perfect, but one of the men turned toward the camera momentarily, his face clearly visible. Renee froze the frame and stared in disbelief. The man was in uniform, a Pine Ridge Police Department uniform. She zoomed in to confirm what she was seeing. Officer Dale Richards, one of the men who had been in the meeting that morning, her hands shaking slightly. Renee copied the files to her secure FBI drive and removed the flash drive. This was far worse than she had imagined. Not just negligence or bias in investigating the crimes, but active participation by a member of the police force. She needed to report this immediately, but also knew she had to be careful. If word got back to Wilson or Walters that she had this footage, The consequences for Officer Chen could be severe. And if police officers were directly involved in the crimes, who else in the department might be complicit? Renee stepped out of the conference room and found Briggs watching her from across the bullpen, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. She nodded professionally in his direction and went back to work, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd discovered. By late afternoon, Renee had reviewed enough of the evidence to confirm her suspicions. The investigation had been deliberately mishandled at multiple levels. Critical evidence had been ignored or lost. Witnesses had been intimidated, and in some cases, officers had filed false reports about what they found at the crime scenes. She needed to speak with her supervisor again, but not from inside the police station. As she was packing up her notes, Chief Wilson appeared at the door. "Leaving so soon, Agent Carter?" he asked, his tone falsely cordial. "Just for the day." "I've got a lot to process," she replied evenly. "Find anything interesting?" "Several leads that need following up," she said, careful not to reveal too much. Wilson stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. I may have been a bit defensive." "It's understandable," Renee said cautiously. "Federal involvement can feel like an intrusion." "Exactly," Wilson nodded. "But I've been chief here for 15 years. I know this town, its people, its problems. These new folks moving in, they don't understand our ways. They keep to themselves, don't join the community. That creates tension." "That doesn't justify targeting their businesses," Renee pointed out. "Of course not," Wilson agreed quickly. "But context matters. Pine Ridge has always taken care of its own problems. Outside interference usually makes things worse. I'm not here to interfere, Chief Wilson. I'm here to ensure justice is served for all residents of Pine Ridge." Wilson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Noble sentiment. But let me give you some friendly advice. These cases, they're not worth ruining your career over." "Is that a threat?" Renee asked, her voice steady despite the chill that ran down her spine. "Just an observation," Wilson replied. "Federal agents who make waves in small towns often find themselves reassigned to less desirable positions. And sometimes they discover that their investigations hit unexpected roadblocks. Evidence gets contaminated, witnesses recant, that sort of thing." "That would be obstruction of justice," Renee said. "A federal offense," Wilson shrugged. "Hard to prove, especially when it's your word against an entire police department." He moved toward the door. "Think about it, Agent Carter. There are easier paths than the one you're on." After he left, Renee sat still for several minutes, processing the conversation. The implied threat was clear: back off or face consequences. But it also told her something important. Wilson was worried. If there was nothing to hide, there would be no need for threats. As she drove back to her motel, Renee couldn't shake the feeling she was being followed. A patrol car had pulled out behind her as she left the station and stayed a few car lengths back, turning when she turned. Intimidation tactics, she thought, meant to scare her off. In her motel room, she pulled the blinds and called her supervisor on a secure line. "The situation is worse than we thought," she said without preamble. "I have evidence that at least one officer was directly involved in the vandalism at the Lynn grocery. And the chief just made veiled threats about my career if I continue the investigation." "Do you feel you're in danger?" her supervisor asked, concern evident in his voice. "Not physically, at least not yet, but they're definitely trying to intimidate me, and I'm concerned about my source within the department. If they identify him, he could be at risk. We need to move quickly then. I can have a team there by tomorrow morning." "That might escalate things unnecessarily," Renee cautioned. "If we bring in a tactical team, they'll close ranks completely. What I need is official authorization to seize all case materials and electronic records before they can be destroyed. I'll get the paperwork started immediately. In the meantime, document everything, every conversation, every threat, every inconsistency in their case files." "Already on it," Renee assured him. "But there's something else. The more I dig into this, the more it feels like these hate crimes are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a culture of corruption in this department that goes beyond bias against immigrants. One battle at a time, Carter. Let's nail them on what we can prove right now." After ending the call, Renee spread her notes across the bed, constructing a timeline of events and identifying key players. Officer Richards, caught on camera vandalizing the grocery, was connected to Sergeant Briggs. They were cousins according to department personnel files. Chief Wilson had promoted Briggs over several more qualified candidates 3 years ago. Captain Walters had been investigated twice for excessive force against minority suspects. But both cases had been dismissed for insufficient evidence. The pattern was becoming clear: a tight-knit group of officers who protected each other while targeting those they saw as outsiders. And now that she was threatening to expose them, they were turning their tactics on her. A knock at her door startled Renee from her thoughts. She approached cautiously, one hand on her weapon. "Who is it?" she called through the door. "Officer Chen," came the quiet reply. Renee checked through the peephole before opening the door. Chen stood there in civilian clothes, looking nervous. "I shouldn't be here," he said, glancing over his shoulder at the empty parking lot. "But you need to know they're planning something. Briggs and Richards were talking in the locker room. They know you've got something on them, and they're not going to let you use it." "Did they mention what they're planning?" Renee asked, ushering him inside and away from the window. "No specifics, but Briggs said something about making sure certain evidence never makes it to court." Chen paused. "There's more. The fire at the Thai restaurant? Richards was on duty that night, first to respond according to the official report. But he wasn't. I was nearby on patrol, heard the call, and got there at least 10 minutes before him. When I asked about it later, Briggs told me to forget what I saw." "Did you see Richards anywhere near the scene before the fire was reported?" Chen hesitated. "I can't say for sure it was him, but I saw a department vehicle parked a block away about 20 minutes before the alarm went off. I didn't think anything of it at the time." "I need you to document everything you've told me," Renee said. "Times, dates, exact words if you can remember them." "That could end my career," Chen said, but there was resolve in his voice. "But I'll do it. This isn't right. It's not what I signed up for." As Chen prepared to leave, Renee caught his arm. "Be careful. Don't take any unnecessary risks. We'll have a team here soon to take over." He nodded grimly. "I better not be seen leaving your room. I'll go out the back way." After Chen left, Renee stood by the window watching the parking lot for any sign of surveillance. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Not only was she dealing with corrupt officers who had committed hate crimes, but they were now actively planning to destroy evidence and potentially threaten witnesses. Tomorrow would bring a confrontation that could tear the Pine Ridge Police Department apart. And based on what she'd learned today, that might be exactly what this town needed. The morning light had barely broken over Pine Ridge when Renee's phone rang. It was her supervisor, his voice tense. "We've got the warrant. Team's on the way, ETA 3 hours. But there's a complication." Renee sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What kind of complication?" "Someone leaked information about our investigation to the local press. There's already a reporter camped outside the police station, asking questions about an FBI probe into civil rights violations." "That's going to put them on high alert," Renee said, her mind racing. "They'll start destroying evidence." "Exactly. You need to get there now, secure what you can. The warrant gives you authority to seize all records related to the hate crimes investigations, plus department communications for the past year." "On my way," Renee said, already pulling on her clothes. She was out the door in 10 minutes. Her badge and credentials ready, her expression set with determination. As she drove to the station, she noticed unusual activity in town. People stood in small groups on street corners talking animatedly. A news van from the regional station was parked outside City Hall. The story was breaking and breaking fast. At the police station, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Officers huddled in small groups, conversations stopping abruptly as Renee walked through the door. The receptionist looked at her with undisguised hostility. "I need to see Chief Wilson immediately," Renee said. "He's in a meeting," the woman replied coldly. "Interrupt it," Renee insisted. "Tell him FBI agent Carter is here with a federal warrant." The receptionist made the call, her lips pressed into a thin line. A moment later, she nodded reluctantly. "You can go back. He's in his office." Renee found Wilson behind his desk with Captain Walters and the department's lawyer, a thin man in an expensive suit, standing nearby. All three looked up with barely concealed anger as she entered. "Agent Carter," Wilson said, his tone icy. "I understand you have something for me." Renee placed the warrant on his desk. Federal warrant to seize all case files, evidence, and departmental communications related to the attacks on immigrant-owned businesses in Pine Ridge, plus any evidence of civil rights violations within the department. The lawyer snatched up the warrant, scanning it quickly. "This is overly broad and invasive." "It's been approved by a federal judge," Renee replied calmly. and a team of FBI agents is on the way to execute it. In the meantime, I'll need all officers to step away from their computers, and I'll need access to your evidence room and file storage immediately. This is outrageous, Walters growled. You can't just come in here and we can and we are, Renee cut him off. And before anyone gets any ideas about deleting emails or shredding documents, let me remind you that tampering with evidence in a federal investigation carries a sentence of up to 20 years. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Wilson's face had gone pale beneath his tan. You're making a serious mistake, he said finally. We've got friends in high places. So do I, Renee replied. Mine just happened to be in the Justice Department. Before Wilson could respond, there was a commotion from the bullpen. Raised voices, a crash, and then Sergeant Briggs burst into the office, his face flushed with anger. Someone talked, he spat before noticing Renee. What's she doing here? Agent Carter has a warrant, Wilson said, his voice tight with controlled fury. They're taking over our cases and our files. Briggs's eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously. They can't do that. Those are our cases, our jurisdiction. Not anymore, Renee said. Now, I need access to the evidence room. Like hell, Briggs snarled, taking a step toward her. Sergeant, Wilson barked. Stand down. He turned to Renee. My officers will cooperate, Agent Carter. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. For the next hour, Renee supervised as officers grudgingly provided access to files and computer systems. She noted who seemed most agitated, who was making furtive phone calls, who kept glancing at the clock as if waiting for something. Officer Chen was conspicuously absent, which worried her. As she was reviewing digital files in the conference room, a young officer she hadn't met before appeared at the door. Agent Carter? There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Renee followed him to the front desk where a middle-aged woman in a neat business suit waited. She extended her hand as Renee approached. Gloria Henderson, Pine Ridge Gazette. I'm the one who broke the story this morning. I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, Renee said automatically. I'm not here for a comment. Henderson replied quietly. I'm here because I have information you need. Can we speak privately? Intrigued, Renee led her to a quiet corner of the lobby. What kind of information? I've been investigating the Pine Ridge PD for months, Henderson explained. Complaints from minority residents, suspicious patterns in arrests and traffic stops, evidence that never seems to make it to court. I was building a story, but sources kept backing out, afraid of retaliation. And now I have a source who's not backing out. Someone inside the department who's willing to go on record about systematic discrimination and cover-ups. Officer Chen, Renee guessed. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. You know him. We've spoken. Is he safe? For now. He came to me early this morning with documents and recordings. He's staying with friends outside town until this blows over. Relief washed over Renee. At least Chen had gotten away before the department could identify him as the whistleblower. What kind of recordings? She asked. Audio from department meetings. Conversations between Briggs and Richards about sending messages to the foreign businesses. And the big one, a recording from yesterday where Chief Wilson and Captain Walters discuss how to block your investigation and make evidence disappear. Renee's pulse quickened. I need those recordings. They're being uploaded to a secure server as we speak, Henderson assured her. Chen wanted to make sure they couldn't be destroyed. But there's more. He says there's a department group chat where officers shared racist memes and openly discussed targeting immigrant businesses. And he thinks the fire at the Thai restaurant wasn't just vandalism gone wrong. It was deliberate arson. Meant to drive the family out of town. That would elevate this to attempted murder, Renee said grimly. Exactly. Chen says Richards bragged about it to Briggs, not realizing Chen could overhear them. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the front entrance. A group of people had gathered outside holding signs. Justice for all residents. No place for hate in Pine Ridge. Reform PRPD now. The community's responding, Henderson observed. Once the story broke, people started organizing. Not everyone in this town agrees with what's been happening. Renee watched as the crowd grew, joined now by the immigrant business owners she'd interviewed, their families, and a diverse group of supporters. Local news crews had arrived, capturing footage of the impromptu protest. Inside the station, officers watched through the windows, their expressions a mixture of anger, worry, and, in a few cases, shame. "This is going to tear the town apart," Walters muttered as he passed Renee in the hallway. "No," she corrected him. "You did that when you decided some residents deserved protection and others didn't." By noon, the FBI team had arrived, 6 agents in dark suits, moving with practiced efficiency as they began the process of securing evidence and interviewing officers. The mood in the station had shifted from defiance to resignation as the reality of the situation sank in. Renee briefed the team leader, Special Agent Thomas, in the conference room. "We've got documented evidence of at least 3 officers directly involved in the hate crimes," she explained, "plus obstruction from department leadership, destruction of evidence, witness intimidation, the works." Thomas nodded grimly. "Justice Department's already talking about a pattern or practice investigation of the entire department. This could lead to federal oversight." "Good," Renee said firmly. "This goes beyond a few bad apples. There's a culture here that needs to be uprooted." As they were talking, a commotion erupted in the bullpen. Sergeant Briggs was being led out in handcuffs by 2 FBI agents, his face contorted with rage. "This is a setup," he shouted. "You can't do this. Wilson, do something." But Chief Wilson was nowhere to be seen. Captain Walters stood frozen by his desk, watching as his colleague was taken away. "What happened?" Renee asked Thomas. "Tech team found something on his phone. Messages coordinating the attacks plus attempts to contact potential witnesses this morning, warning them to keep quiet. Enough for an immediate arrest on obstruction and conspiracy charges." Throughout the afternoon, the scene repeated itself. Officer Richards was brought in from patrol and arrested. 2 other officers were detained for questioning. Evidence boxes were carried out to FBI vehicles while a crowd of townspeople watched, some cheering, others recording with their phones. The local news had gone national. By late afternoon, cable networks were running the story. FBI raids small-town police department over alleged hate crimes and cover-up. Renee stepped outside briefly, needing a moment of fresh air amid the chaos. The protest had grown, with people on both sides now facing off across the street from the station. Signs supporting the police had appeared, held by angry residents shouting about outside interference and witch hunts. As she watched, a familiar figure approached from the crowd. Mrs. Lynn, the owner of the vandalized grocery store. She carried a small bag and offered it to Renee with a shy smile. "For you, homemade almond cookies. Small thank you for what you do." Touched, Renee accepted the gift. "I'm just doing my job, Mrs. Lynn." "No," the older woman said firmly. "Many people do job. Few people do right thing when hard. You do right thing." The simple words hit Renee harder than she expected. In the whirlwind of the investigation, it was easy to lose sight of the human impact. Families who had lived in fear, who had seen their livelihoods threatened and their safety compromised, all while those sworn to protect them looked the other way or actively participated in their persecution. Her moment of reflection was interrupted by Agent Thomas, who hurried out of the station with urgent news. "Wilson's gone. Left through the back about an hour ago. And we can't locate Walters either. They're running," Renee realized. "Put out an alert. They can't have gotten far." As they re-entered the station, Gloria Henderson intercepted them, her expression grave. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. On the screen was a social media post from a local community group. "Chief Wilson to hold press conference at City Hall at 3 p.m. to address false allegations and federal overreach." "He's trying to control the narrative," Thomas said. "Get public opinion on his side before we can present our evidence." "It won't work," Renee said confidently. "Not with what we have, and especially not with this." She held up her phone, displaying an email that had just arrived from Officer Chen, a video file with the caption, "Watch to the end." They huddled around Renee's phone as she played the clip. It showed a department meeting from 2 weeks earlier, filmed secretly from someone's body camera. Chief Wilson stood at the front of the room addressing his officers. "These people need to understand they're not welcome here," he said, his voice clear in the recording. "I'm not saying take direct action. That would be illegal." A chorus of knowing chuckles followed. "But if response times to certain neighborhoods are slower, if some evidence gets misplaced, if witnesses feel they'd rather not cooperate, well, that's just the reality of limited resources, isn't it?" The video continued, showing Walters and Briggs discussing specific tactics for intimidating immigrant residents, followed by an explicit admission from Richards about his involvement in the vandalism. But it was the final moments of the video that were most damning. Wilson speaking directly to Briggs with no awareness he was being recorded. "If that Thai place doesn't get the message after this, we might need to send a clearer one. Nothing lethal, but maybe next time the family doesn't make it out so easily." Renee looked up from the screen, her expression hard. "We've got them. All of them. On conspiracy, civil rights violations, and now conspiracy to commit attempted murder." Thomas was already on his phone, calling in reinforcements to intercept Wilson before his press conference. Henderson was typing furiously on her own phone, no doubt preparing to break the story of the damning video. The operation that had begun as an investigation into hate crimes had exploded into something much larger. The exposure of systemic corruption and racism within an entire police department, with national attention now focused on the small town of Pine Ridge. As Renee watched the FBI team continue their methodical work, seizing evidence and interviewing officers, she knew that Wilson's press conference would never happen. Instead, he and his co-conspirators would face federal charges and the full weight of justice they had denied to others for so long. Outside, the crowd of protesters had begun to sing, their voices rising in harmony. "We shall overcome." The sound drifted through the open windows of the police station, a reminder of why this work mattered, not just for the letter of the law, but for the people whose lives and dignity depended on its equal application. The exposure was complete. Now the reckoning would begin. The next morning dawned with a strange quiet over Pine Ridge. The town had barely slept, as news of the FBI raid and the arrests of multiple police officers spread through social media, text messages, and late-night phone calls. By sunrise, news vans from major networks had joined the local stations, setting up satellite dishes and camera positions outside the police station and City Hall. Chief Wilson had never made it to his planned press conference. FBI agents had intercepted him at a gas station 30 miles outside of town, apparently on his way to a private airfield. Captain Walters had been found at his sister's house 2 towns over, hurriedly packing a suitcase. Both men had been arrested without incident, though Wilson had demanded his phone call with the confidence of a man who believed he had friends in high places who could make this all go away. Renee sat in what had been Wilson's office, now the temporary command center for the FBI operation. The walls had been stripped of plaques and photos, the desk cleared of personal items. It felt like the room was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Agent Thomas entered with coffee and a grim expression. "Just got word from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're moving forward with charges against Wilson, Walters, Briggs, Richards, and 2 other officers. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and for Richards' arson and attempted murder for the Thai restaurant fire." "What about the rest of the department?" Renee asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Being evaluated case by case. Some were clearly just following orders. Others were active participants in the discrimination. Department of Justice is sending a team to consider a consent decree. Federal oversight of the department going forward." Renee nodded. A consent decree would mean years of reforms, monitoring, and accountability measures. It was the right solution for a department where the rot had spread so deeply. And Officer Chen, protected under whistleblower status. He'll testify before the grand jury next week. His career here is over, obviously, but the Bureau's already talking about offering him a position after this is all settled. "Good," Renee said. He risked everything to do the right thing. The morning briefing was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the window, Renee could see a crowd gathering in front of the station, larger than yesterday's protest. But this wasn't just immigrants and their supporters. It was a cross-section of the town, faces of all colors and ages, holding signs with messages like "Rebuild PRPD" and "Equal Justice for All." "Looks like the town's waking up," Thomas observed. "About time," Renee replied. Her phone buzzed with a text from Gloria Henderson. "Mayor called emergency town council meeting for noon. You might want to be there." The town hall was packed to capacity when Renee arrived. She slipped into the back, wanting to observe rather than be the center of attention. The mayor, a portly man with a nervous demeanor, called for order as he stepped up to the microphone. "Folks, I know we're all shocked and disturbed by the events of the past 48 hours, he began, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "The allegations against members of our police department are serious and troubling. If true, they represent a betrayal of public trust that cannot be tolerated. A murmur ran through the crowd at the word, if. One woman stood up, her voice ringing clear across the room. They're not allegations anymore, Mayor Davis. We've all seen the videos. We've all heard the recordings. Our police department has been terrorizing part of our community, while the rest of us looked the other way. Applause and shouts of agreement followed her statement. The mayor looked increasingly uncomfortable. Yes, well, there is certainly evidence that inappropriate actions were taken by certain officers. But we shouldn't condemn the entire department based on the actions of a few. This time it was an older white man who stood up, his face lined with anger. My shop's next door to the Garcia's auto repair. For months I watched patrol cars drive by, slow, officers glaring in their windows. I saw how they'd get pulled over leaving work, how their customers would get hassled. I didn't say anything because I didn't want trouble. That makes me part of the problem, too. The mood in the room shifted as more residents stood to share stories, witnessing harassment of immigrant residents, hearing officers make racist comments, seeing the deliberate slowness of police response to certain neighborhoods. Years of small moments that, taken together, painted a picture of systematic discrimination that had been allowed to fester unchallenged. The mayor, sensing the direction of public opinion, quickly changed tack, which is why we need to take decisive action to restore trust. I'm announcing the formation of a civilian review board to oversee police operations going forward, and we'll be conducting a national search for a new chief who can lead the department with integrity and ensure equal protection for all residents. It was a political pivot, Renee thought, but not necessarily an insincere one. The mayor was responding to the will of his constituents, which was how democracy was supposed to work. The meeting continued with impassioned speeches, tears, and occasionally heated exchanges. The town was processing its collective failure, confronting uncomfortable truths about who had been protected and who had been left vulnerable. It was messy and painful, but necessary. As the meeting was wrapping up, Renee slipped out, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Outside, she found Gloria Henderson talking with a group that included Mrs. Lynn, Mr. Sawat, and other victims of the hate crimes. "Agent Carter," Henderson called, waving her over. "These folks wanted to thank you personally." Renee felt uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I was just doing my job." "No," Mr. Sawat said firmly, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "You listened when others would not. You believed when others doubted. This makes all difference." Mrs. Lynn nodded in agreement. "Now we can rebuild, without fear." The group dispersed, leaving Renee alone with Henderson. The journalist studied her thoughtfully. "You know, when Chen first came to me with his story, I was skeptical. It seemed too extreme, too clear-cut, a case of corruption. But everything checked out. Every recording, every document, every witness statement. It makes you wonder how long this could have continued if you hadn't pushed." "Someone would have exposed it eventually," Renee said. Henderson shook her head. "I'm not so sure. Small towns have a way of keeping secrets, especially when those in power benefit from the status quo." Back at the police station, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The remaining officers, those not implicated in the corruption, moved with a sense of subdued purpose, cooperating fully with the FBI team. Some seemed genuinely relieved that the truth had come out, as if a weight had been lifted. Renee found Agent Thomas in the conference room, reviewing personnel files. "How's it going here?" she asked. "Revealing," he replied, gesturing to the stacks of folders. "We're finding patterns going back years. Traffic stops disproportionately targeting minority drivers, harassment disguised as routine checks, complaints buried or dismissed without investigation. And no one in the department stood up against it? Besides Chen? A few tried early on. They were either pushed out or wore down and accepted it as just how things are done here. Classic toxic culture. Conform or leave." Renee nodded, understanding all too well how such environments perpetuated themselves. "What happens to the department now? Short term? State police will help cover patrols while we sort things out. Long term? Complete rebuild, probably under a consent decree. New leadership, new policies, new training, regular audits." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. Thomas took it, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he listened. "What is it?" Renee asked when he hung up. "Wilson's attorney is already floating a deal. He's claiming he has dirt on powerful people, politicians, judges, business leaders who supported or enabled the department's practices. He's offering names in exchange for leniency. Classic rat jumping from the sinking ship, Renee said with disgust. Maybe. But the U.S. attorney thinks there might be something to it. This kind of systematic corruption doesn't exist in isolation. There had to be people looking the other way, providing cover. The implications were sobering. If Wilson's claims were true, the investigation could expand well beyond the police department, potentially implicating community leaders who had enabled or protected the corrupt officers. Later that afternoon, Renee drove to a small diner on the outskirts of town where Officer Chen had agreed to meet her. He sat in a back booth looking exhausted but somehow lighter than when she'd last seen him. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him. "Better than I expected," he admitted, scared about what comes next but relieved it's finally out in the open. Living with what I knew, seeing it happen every day but feeling powerless to stop it. That was worse. "You weren't powerless," Renee pointed out. "You did stop it at great personal risk." Chen shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what any decent cop should do. That's the problem. Too many forgot what the badge is supposed to mean." They talked for an hour about what Chen had witnessed during his time on the force, filling in details that would strengthen the case against Wilson and the others. As they were finishing, Chen looked up with sudden intensity. "There's something else you should know. Something I didn't put in my official statement because I can't prove it." Renee leaned forward, attentive. "What is it?" "About 6 months ago, before the hate crime started, there was a meeting at Wilson's house. Not an official department thing, more like a social gathering, but only certain officers were invited. The ones Wilson trusted. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was dating Wilson's niece at the time, and we stopped by to pick something up." Chen took a deep breath before continuing. "I overheard Wilson talking with some men I didn't recognize. They were discussing reclaiming the town and sending a message to the newcomers. One of them mentioned funding for community protection efforts that wouldn't have official oversight." "You think the hate crimes were planned? Coordinated with people outside the department?" Renee asked, the implications immediately clear. "I think they were encouraged and possibly financed by business interests who didn't want the competition from immigrant-owned shops. Wilson talked about our backers sometimes, people who appreciated how we kept Pine Ridge the way it should be. If true, this would expand the conspiracy beyond the police department to include civilian co-conspirators, potentially prominent members of the community who had used the corrupt officers as their enforcers." "I'll look into it," Renee promised. "If there's evidence of outside involvement, we'll find it." That evening, as Renee prepared her notes for the next day's briefing, her phone rang with a call from her supervisor. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest, Carter," he said without preamble. "I'm getting calls from the director's office. This case has high-level attention now." "Because of Wilson's claims about influential co-conspirators?" "Partly. But also because similar patterns have been identified in other small departments across the state. Justice Department is considering expanding the investigation, looking for connections." "You think this goes beyond Pine Ridge?" Renee asked, the scope of the potential conspiracy expanding in her mind. "That's what we need to find out. For now, stay focused on nailing down the Pine Ridge case, but keep your eyes open for any links to outside influences or patterns that match other jurisdictions." After hanging up, Renee stood at the window of her motel room, looking out at the quiet street. Pine Ridge looked peaceful in the evening light, just as it had when she'd first arrived. But now she knew better than to trust appearances. The town was at a crossroads, forced to confront the rot that had been growing within its institutions and the complicity of those who had remained silent. Some would resist the changes ahead, clinging to the comfort of the way things had been. Others would embrace the opportunity for renewal and justice. As for the officers whose corruption and racism had been exposed, their lives were indeed collapsing around them. Wilson sat in a federal holding cell, his reputation in tatters, his freedom soon to be forfeit. Walters had been abandoned by his wife, who publicly stated she couldn't stay with a man who had betrayed his oath so completely. Briggs and Richards faced years in prison for their direct involvement in the hate crimes. The consequences they now faced were of their own making, the result of choices made day after day to abuse their power, to target the vulnerable, to betray the trust placed in them by the community they had sworn to protect. Renee turned away from the window and returned to her notes. The work wasn't finished. There were still questions to answer, connections to uncover, justice to secure. But for the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, she felt certain that the truth would prevail, no matter how many powerful people might wish to keep it hidden. 6 months passed like a slow-moving storm over Pine Ridge. The once quiet town had become a case study in how quickly a community could transform when forced to confront its darkest aspects. The national media spotlight had moved on to other stories, but the work of rebuilding continued day by day, with both setbacks and progress. Renee Carter returned to Pine Ridge on a crisp autumn morning, driving past familiar streets that now felt different somehow. New signs hung in shop windows, "All welcome here" and "Pine Ridge United," small symbols of the change taking place. The Thai restaurant had reopened, rebuilt with help from community donations. The Lynn Grocery had expanded, adding a small section of prepared foods that had become popular with local workers. The police station, once a fortress of corruption, now operated under new leadership. Interim Chief Diana Lawson, a veteran officer from a neighboring county with a sterling reputation for integrity, had been brought in to oversee the transition. The building itself had been renovated, walls repainted. The layout opened up to create more transparency, with a new community meeting room where local residents could voice concerns directly to officers. Renee parked her car and sat for a moment, collecting her thoughts. She wasn't here in an official capacity this time. The case against Wilson and his co-conspirators had been handed over to prosecutors months ago, but she had promised to return for the final community forum before the consent decree was officially implemented, and she kept her promises. Inside, the station was barely recognizable. Gone was the hostile atmosphere, the suspicious glances, the sense of an organization circling the wagons against outsiders. Instead, officers, some familiar, many new, moved with purpose, nodding respectfully to Renee as she entered. Chief Lawson greeted her warmly. "Agent Carter, good to see you again." "You too, Chief. How are things progressing?" "Every day gets a little better," Lawson replied, leading Renee to her office, the same space once occupied by Wilson, but now bright with natural light from uncovered windows and decorated with community outreach awards and family photos. "We've hired 8 new officers, including 4 who speak Spanish and 2 who speak Vietnamese. Our response times are now consistent across all neighborhoods, and complaints against officers are down 60%. Impressive progress in 6 months, Renee observed. "We still have a long way to go," Lawson admitted. "Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, but people are giving us a chance, which is all we can ask for." As they talked, Renee found herself remembering the dark days of the investigation, the threats, the obstruction, the shocking revelation of just how deeply racism and corruption had infiltrated the department. It seemed almost impossible that the same institution could be transformed so completely in such a short time. "What happened to Officer Chen?" she asked, thinking of the young officer whose courage had helped break the case open. "He's doing well," Lawson said with a smile, decided not to join the FBI after all. "He's working with the state police now, helping develop their community outreach program. Comes back to visit sometimes. He's a bit of a local hero, though he hates when anyone calls him that." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young officer, one of the new hires, judging by the freshness of her uniform, poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Chief, but they're ready for you at the community center. The forum's about to start." "We'll be right there," Lawson said, standing. "You ready for this, Agent Carter? Some people might have strong feelings about seeing you again." "I can handle it," Renee replied with a confidence she mostly felt. The community center was packed when they arrived. Rows of chairs had been arranged to face a small stage, where a table with microphones awaited the speakers. The crowd was diverse. Longtime residents sitting alongside newer immigrant families, teenagers next to seniors. People from all walks of life gathered to discuss the future of their town's policing. As Renee and Chief Lawson made their way to the stage, the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some faces brightened with recognition, others darkened with resentment. Change was never universally welcome, especially when it came on the heels of painful revelations. The mayor, who had somehow survived the political fallout of the scandal, opened the proceedings with a speech about moving forward and healing divisions. Political language that skimmed the surface of deeper issues. But the community members who spoke next brought the reality into sharper focus. Mr. Suwat, whose restaurant had been burned, described how he now felt safe calling the police when there was trouble. Mrs. Lynn spoke about officers stopping by her store not to intimidate, but to check on her well-being and build rapport. A longtime resident admitted that he had been skeptical of the federal intervention, but now saw the benefits of a more accountable police force. Not all voices were positive. Some residents complained about perceived increases in crime during the transition. Others worried about the costs of the reforms. A few openly resented the changes, using coded language about traditional values and outside interference. When it was Renee's turn to speak, she kept her remarks brief and focused on the future rather than the past. 6 months ago, I came to Pine Ridge because a pattern of crimes was going unsolved, she said. What I found was a breach of trust so severe that it threatened the very fabric of this community. Today, I see a town that had the courage to face uncomfortable truths and begin the hard work of rebuilding. That work isn't finished. It may never be completely finished. Justice and equality require constant vigilance, but the progress I've seen here gives me hope, not just for Pine Ridge, but for communities across the country facing similar challenges. After the forum concluded, Renee found herself surrounded by people wanting to share their stories or simply shake her hand. Among them was Gloria Henderson, the journalist whose coverage had helped expose the scandal. Quite a different scene from the last time you were here, Henderson observed, gesturing to the mingling crowd where officers chatted comfortably with residents of all backgrounds. Night and day, Renee agreed. How's the follow-up story coming? Henderson had been working on a comprehensive account of the case and its aftermath, interviewing everyone from the victims of the hate crimes to the federal prosecutors handling the cases against Wilson and his co-conspirators. Almost finished. It's been quite a journey, tracking all the threads. Henderson lowered her voice. Including those outside connections you were investigating. Did anything ever come of that? Renee hesitated before answering. The investigation into Wilson's claims about influential backers had indeed yielded results, troubling ones. A network of businessmen and political figures across several counties had been identified, linked by financial transactions, communications, and a shared ideology that viewed demographic changes as threats to their power and way of life. That's still developing, she said carefully. But yes, there were connections. The case has expanded well beyond Pine Ridge. I thought so, Henderson nodded. I've been hearing whispers about grand jury subpoenas going out to some surprisingly prominent people. Before they could discuss it further, they were joined by a familiar face, Officer Ryan Chen, now wearing the uniform of the state police. He looked more confident than when Renee had last seen him, standing taller, his expression open rather than guarded. Agent Carter. Good to see you again. You too, Officer Chen. Or should I say Trooper now? He smiled. Still getting used to the title myself. How does it feel being back here? Surreal, Renee admitted. In a good way. Your old department is nearly unrecognizable. I stop by sometimes. It's healing in a way, seeing what it can become instead of what it was. They were interrupted by the arrival of Chief Lawson, who was making her rounds through the crowd. Chen, good to see you. Your community engagement program is getting attention at the state level. We've been using some of your materials in our training. Chen looked embarrassed but pleased, just building on what I've learned from both sides of this experience. As they talked, Renee found herself stepping back, observing the interactions around her. The human capacity for change, both individual and institutional, never ceased to amaze her. 6 months ago, this town had been fractured by fear, suspicion, and hate. The wounds weren't fully healed and perhaps never would be completely, but the healing had undeniably begun. Later, as the event wound down, Renee took a walk through town. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath her feet as she passed the businesses that had once been targeted, now thriving, their owners no longer living in fear. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. News coming tomorrow. Wilson's cooperation paid off. Indictments against 3 county commissioners and a state representative. This goes deeper than we thought. Renee wasn't surprised. Corruption and racism this entrenched rarely existed in isolation. There were always enablers, beneficiaries, silent partners who provided protection or looked the other way. The case that had begun with broken windows and hateful graffiti had revealed a network of power and prejudice that extended far beyond Pine Ridge's borders. As she walked, Renee passed the courthouse where, just 2 weeks earlier, the trials of the former officers had concluded. Wilson had received 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his testimony against others. Walters had gone to trial and received 18 years for his role in the conspiracy and obstruction. Briggs and Richards, convicted of direct involvement in the hate crimes, including the arson, had received 25 years each. Their lives had indeed collapsed, just as swiftly and completely as they had brought fear and suffering to innocent families. It wasn't vengeance that Renee felt when thinking about their fates, but a somber satisfaction that justice had been served. Near the town square, a new monument had been erected, a simple stone marker with the words, "Equal justice under law," and the date the consent decree had been signed. It wasn't fancy or imposing, but it represented a commitment made by a community that had been forced to look at its darkest aspects and choose a different path forward. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Renee found herself sitting on a bench next to the monument. A woman approached, hesitated, then sat beside her. "You're the FBI agent, aren't you? The one who exposed everything?" Renee nodded, studying the woman curiously. She was in her 60s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime in this town. "My husband was a cop here for 30 years, the woman said, looking straight ahead rather than at Renee. "Retired 5 years before all this happened. He used to come home sometimes, troubled by things he'd seen or heard. But he never spoke up. Never made waves. That was just how things were done." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. "After the scandal broke, he couldn't sleep. Kept saying maybe if he'd said something years ago, things wouldn't have gotten so bad. The guilt was eating him alive." "It's never just one person's responsibility," Renee said gently. "No, but we all have choices," the woman replied. "My husband chose the easy path, the quiet path, until he couldn't live with it anymore." She finally turned to look at Renee. "He's been working with some of the immigrant families, helping them navigate the system, translating when needed. At his age, learning Vietnamese and Spanish." She smiled slightly. "Says it's the least he can do." "That takes courage," Renee observed. "Starting over, facing past mistakes." "This whole town is starting over in a way," the woman said, rising to leave. "Some don't like it. They wish things could go back to how they were. But for others, it's like we can finally breathe. Like a weight we didn't even know we were carrying has been lifted." As the woman walked away, Renee remained on the bench, watching as streetlights flickered on and Pine Ridge settled into evening. Tomorrow she would head back to the field office, back to new cases and challenges. But a part of her would always remain connected to this town and its journey. The case had begun with hate and ended with the possibility of healing. It had exposed the worst in some people and brought out the best in others. Most importantly, it had shown that systems built on prejudice and corruption could be dismantled, reformed, rebuilt, not easily or quickly, but persistently, one day at a time. As darkness fell over Pine Ridge, Renee finally stood and walked back to her car. The police station was visible in the distance, its windows glowing with light that spilled onto the street. No longer a fortress of secrecy and fear, but a beacon of what change could look like when justice was allowed to prevail. The lives of those who had stood in the way,